The morning sun was just starting to peek through the gray clouds when Robert Martinez stepped off the city bus. His worn leather shoes touched the pavement with the careful steps of a man who had learned to move slowly but steadily. At 78 years old, Bobby carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of decades lived with purpose, even though his body showed the wear of time and old wounds. He pulled his faded army jacket tighter around his shoulders as the October wind cut through the parking lot of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. The jacket had seen better days, just like Bobby himself. The fabric was thin in places, and one of the buttons hung by a single thread, but he wore it with the same pride he had felt 50 years ago when it was new and pressed. Bobby's weathered baseball cap sat perfectly straight on his silver hair. The cap bore the simple words Vietnam Veteran in faded yellow letters, though most people walking past him wouldn't bother to read them. To them, he was just another elderly man shuffling through his day, invisible in the way that older people often become in a world that moves too fast to notice. But Bobby Martinez was far from ordinary. Beneath that quiet exterior lay stories that could fill books, memories that could make grown men weep, and a courage that had been tested in ways most people could never imagine. His chest carried scars from shrapnel that had torn through his uniform during a firefight in the jungles of Southeast Asia. His left hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from nerve damage sustained when he had pulled 3 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy enemy fire. The automatic doors of the medical center whooshed open as Bobby approached. The blast of warm air carried the familiar smell of disinfectant and floor wax that reminded him of military hospitals from long ago. He paused for just a moment, gathering himself the way he always did before entering places that brought back memories he kept locked away most days. Inside, the waiting area buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that medical facilities seem to generate naturally. People moved in all directions, some walking quickly with purpose, others moving slowly with the careful steps of those dealing with pain or uncertainty. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh clinical glow that made everyone look a little tired and a little older than they really were. Bobby made his way to the reception desk, his steps measured and deliberate. In his right hand, he clutched a crumpled appointment slip that he had checked at least a dozen times during the bus ride. The paper was worn soft from his nervous handling, the edges slightly torn where his fingers had worried at it during moments of anxiety about the day ahead. Behind the reception desk sat a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Her name tag read Ashley, and she was typing furiously on her computer keyboard while simultaneously answering phone calls through her headset. Monday mornings at the VA were always busy, and Ashley had already fielded dozens of calls from veterans trying to reschedule appointments, confirm procedures, or simply get someone to listen to their concerns. Bobby waited patiently at the counter, his appointment slip ready in his hand. He had arrived 30 minutes early, as was his habit for any important appointment. In the military, being early wasn't just encouraged, it was expected, and old habits die hard. While he waited, he watched the controlled chaos around him with the observant eyes of someone who had learned long ago to assess his surroundings quickly and thoroughly. Ashley finished her phone call and looked up at Bobby with the kind of expression that suggested she was already thinking about the next task on her endless list. Her eyes barely met his as she spoke in a voice that carried the weariness of someone who had already been working for 3 hours and had 5 more to go. "Next," she said, though Bobby was the only person standing at her counter. The word came, out flat and mechanical, like she had said it 1,000 times before and would say it 1,000 times more before the day was over. Bobby stepped forward slightly and placed his appointment slip on the counter. His voice was soft but clear as he spoke, carrying the slight accent of someone who had grown up in a Spanish-speaking household, but had spent most of his adult life speaking English in the military. "Good morning, miss. I have an appointment with cardiology at 10:30. Could you please tell me which way I need to go?" His words were polite and respectful, the kind of courtesy that had been drilled into him during basic training and reinforced through decades of military service. Ashley glanced at the appointment slip without really reading it, her fingers already moving to input information into her computer. She sighed in a way that suggested Bobby's simple question was somehow an inconvenience to her busy schedule. Her eyes rolled slightly as she gestured vaguely toward a long hallway that stretched away from the reception area. Cardiology is down. That hall. Take a left at the end, go through 2 sets of doors, and it's on your right. The elevator is broken, so you'll have to take the stairs if you need the 2nd floor. Her words came out in a rapid-fire sequence that suggested she had given these directions many times before and didn't particularly care if Bobby could follow them or not. Bobby nodded his thanks and turned to head down the hallway, but Ashley was already answering another phone call before he had taken 2 steps. Her attention had moved on to the next task, the next problem, the next person who needed something from her. Bobby was already forgotten, just another face in the endless stream of people who passed through her day. As he walked down the hallway, Bobby's left hand trembled slightly at his side. The tremor wasn't from nervousness about his appointment, though he did worry about what the doctors might tell him about his heart. The trembling was a constant reminder of a day long ago when he had crawled through enemy fire to reach a wounded soldier who was crying for his mother in a language Bobby didn't understand, but in a voice that spoke of universal pain and fear. The hallway seemed longer than Ashley had made it sound, and Bobby's steps grew slower as he navigated the maze of corridors that all looked exactly the same. His breathing became a little labored, not from the physical exertion but from the memories that places like this always brought rushing back. Hospitals meant wounded soldiers, and wounded soldiers meant firefights, and firefights meant friends who didn't make it home. He paused at a water fountain to catch his breath and check his watch. Still 20 minutes early, just the way he liked it. As he straightened up, he noticed a group of younger people gathered near a vending machine, their voices carrying the easy laughter of those who had never known real hardship. They were probably family members visiting someone or perhaps employees on their break, but to Bobby they represented a world that sometimes seemed to have forgotten the price that had been paid for their freedom to laugh so carelessly. Bobby continued down the hallway, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. Each step carried him closer to his appointment, but also deeper into a building filled with other veterans, other men and women who had served their country and were now navigating the complicated world of medical care and bureaucracy that came with growing older. The cardiology waiting area was exactly what Bobby had expected, rows of chairs filled with people of all ages, though most were closer to his own age than to Ashley's. The air conditioning hummed loudly, fighting against the heat generated by too many bodies in too small a space. The walls were decorated with generic artwork that was probably chosen more for its inoffensive nature than for any artistic merit. Bobby found an empty chair near the back of the waiting area and settled in for what he knew would be a long wait. He had learned long ago that medical appointments rarely started on time, and complaining about it wouldn't make the doctors move any faster. He folded his hands in his lap and prepared to wait with the same patience he had once used to sit motionless in a jungle for hours, watching for enemy movement that might never come. Bobby had been sitting in the cardiology waiting room for about 15 minutes when his hearing aid started acting up. The small device had been giving him trouble for weeks, making a high-pitched whistling sound that seemed to come and go without warning. He had meant to get it fixed, but like many things in his life, it kept getting pushed aside for more urgent matters. The whistling started quietly at first, just a soft sound that Bobby hoped nobody else would notice. But as he shifted in his chair, trying to find a more comfortable position, the sound grew louder and more persistent. He reached up to adjust the small device behind his ear, his fingers working carefully to try to stop the annoying noise. Around the waiting room, people began to look up from their magazines and phones. At first it was just quick glances, the kind people make when they're trying to figure out where an unfamiliar sound is coming from. But as the whistling continued, the glances became stares, and the stares became expressions of irritation. A woman sitting 3 chairs away from Bobby sighed loudly and shook her head. She was probably in her 40s, well-dressed in the kind of business clothes that suggested she was successful and used to having things go her way. Her name tag identified her as a visitor, not a patient, which meant she was probably there, with a family member. She whispered something to the man sitting next to her, and both of them looked at Bobby with the kind of expression usually reserved for crying babies on airplanes. Bobby's face flushed with embarrassment as he continued, trying to fix his hearing aid. His fingers, already unsteady from his old injuries, seemed to shake even more under the pressure of everyone watching him. The more nervous he became, the harder it was to make the small adjustments needed to stop the whistling. Some people really need to get their equipment checked before they come out in public, the woman said, her voice loud enough to be heard over the whistling but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if anyone called her out for being rude. Her companion, a man about the same age wearing an expensive watch and designer shoes, nodded in agreement. You'd think common courtesy would kick in at some point, he replied, making no effort to keep his voice down. I mean, we're all dealing with enough stress already without having to listen to that noise. Bobby finally managed to stop the whistling by turning off his hearing aid completely. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been, leaving him in a world where voices became muffled and conversations turned into indistinct murmurs. He had grown used to living in this quieter world when his hearing aid wasn't working properly, but it always made him feel more isolated and disconnected from everything happening around him. With his hearing aid off, Bobby couldn't make out the exact words of the conversations happening around him, but he could read body language well enough to know that people were talking about him. The woman in business clothes was still shaking her head and making animated gestures toward his direction. The man with the expensive watch was scrolling through his phone, but his eyes kept drifting back to Bobby with obvious annoyance. A few minutes later, a medical assistant appeared in the waiting area carrying a tablet and looking harried. She was probably in her 30s, wearing scrubs that had seen better days and sneakers that suggested she spent most of her day on her feet. Her name badge read, Jennifer. And she had the tired look of someone who was already counting the hours until her shift ended. Jennifer called out a name, but with his hearing aid turned off, Bobby couldn't make out what she was saying. He watched as another patient got up and followed her through a doorway that led to the examination rooms. When Jennifer returned a few minutes later, she was carrying a stack of tablets and began distributing them to patients who hadn't yet completed their intake forms. She approached Bobby with one of the tablets, holding it out to him with the kind of smile that was probably genuine but had been worn thin by repetition. Sir, you'll need to fill out these forms before your appointment, she said, speaking loudly because she noticed his hearing aid wasn't working. Bobby looked at the tablet with confusion. He had grown up in an era of paper forms and carbon copies, and while he wasn't completely unfamiliar with modern technology, touchscreen devices still felt foreign and intimidating to him. His thick fingers, scarred from old injuries, didn't seem to work well with the smooth glass surface. He tapped the screen tentatively, trying to figure out how to make the cursor appear in the first text box. The tablet responded by jumping to a completely different screen, showing him options he didn't understand. He tried tapping the back button, but that only seemed to make things worse. Jennifer watched him struggle for about 30 seconds before her patience ran out. The waiting room was busy. She had a dozen other tasks to complete before lunch, and watching elderly patients fumble with technology wasn't how she wanted to spend her morning. Sir, it's really not that complicated, she said, her voice carrying a tone of barely concealed frustration. You just tap where you want to type and then use the keyboard that pops up. It's pretty basic stuff. Bobby looked up at her with apologetic eyes. I'm sorry, miss. I'm not very good with these computer things. Could you maybe show me how to get started? Jennifer sighed in a way that made it clear she considered this request to be an unreasonable burden on her time. Around the waiting room, other people were starting to pay attention to the interaction, and Bobby could feel their eyes on him even though he couldn't hear their whispered comments. Look, sir, I've got 20 other patients to deal with this morning, Jennifer said, her voice getting louder and more impatient. These tablets are designed to be user-friendly. Maybe you could ask someone in your family to help you next time. She walked away before Bobby could explain that he didn't have any family members who could come with him to appointments, or that he had been trying to figure out the tablet on his own to avoid being a bother to anyone. He was left sitting there with the device in his hands, still confused about how to make it work, and now feeling even more self-conscious about his struggles. The woman in business clothes had been watching the entire interaction, and she turned to her companion with an exaggerated eye roll. Honestly, some people just refuse to adapt to the modern world, she said, making no effort to keep her voice down. It's like they expect everyone else to accommodate their limitations instead of making an effort to keep up with technology. Her companion nodded enthusiastically. It's the same everywhere you go now. People who can't figure out basic things holding up the line for everyone else. I mean, how hard is it to fill out a simple form? Other people in the waiting area began to join the conversation, sharing their own stories about elderly people who couldn't handle technology or who seemed to expect special treatment because of their age. The discussion grew more animated as people fed off each other's frustration, turning Bobby into a symbol of everything they found annoying about dealing with older generations. Bobby continued working with the tablet, his fingers moving slowly and carefully across the screen. Every mistake seemed to make the device less cooperative, and every failed attempt to correct those mistakes made him more aware of the conversations happening around him. Even with his hearing aid turned off, he could see people pointing in his direction and shaking their heads with disapproval. A younger man sitting near the vending machines joined the conversation about technology and older people. He was probably in his 20s, wearing jeans and a college sweatshirt, and had the confident air of someone who had grown up with computers and smartphones. His comments were particularly cutting, delivered with the casual cruelty that sometimes comes naturally to people who have never experienced real vulnerability themselves. The group dynamic began to feed on itself, with each person trying to top the others with stories and observations about frustrating encounters with elderly people who couldn't keep up with modern life. What had started as mild irritation about Bobby's hearing aid had evolved into a broader discussion about aging, technology, and the perceived selfishness of older generations who expected accommodation rather than adaptation. Bobby finally managed to complete the first section of the digital form, but by then the conversation around him had moved far beyond his specific struggles with the tablet. He had become, without his knowledge or consent, the focal point of a discussion about everything that was wrong with people his age. The irony was lost on everyone in the room that they were sitting in a medical facility, specifically designed to serve veterans, many of whom had sacrificed their youth and health in service to their country. Bobby had finally managed to complete most of the forms on the tablet when disaster struck again. As he shifted in his chair to relieve the pressure on his lower back, his elbow accidentally knocked against the small stack of papers he had been carrying. The documents scattered across the floor like leaves in a windstorm, spreading out in different directions under chairs and across the walkway. His medication list, insurance cards, and appointment confirmations lay scattered around his feet and beyond his immediate reach. For a moment, Bobby just sat there staring at the mess he had created. The papers represented hours of careful organization at home, each document sorted and arranged in the order he thought he might need them. Now they were spread across a floor that dozens of people had walked on that morning. With a quiet sigh that nobody else could hear, Bobby began the slow process of getting out of his chair. His knees protested as he started to stand, the old injuries and decades of wear making every movement deliberate and careful. His left hand trembled more noticeably as he used the armrest to push himself up, the stress of the situation making his nerve damage more apparent. Once he was standing, Bobby had to lower himself carefully toward the floor to reach the scattered papers. The process was awkward and painful, his 78-year-old body not designed for this kind of bending and stretching. He got down on one knee first, using his right hand to steady himself against his chair, then slowly reached for the nearest piece of paper. Around him, the waiting room continued its normal flow of activity, but now Bobby had become an obstacle in the middle of the walkway. People walking between the reception desk and the examination rooms had to step around him and his scattered papers. Instead of stopping to help or even asking if he was okay, they simply navigated around him as if he were a piece of furniture that had been inconveniently placed in their path. A woman in her 50s carrying a purse that probably cost more than Bobby's monthly disability check approached from the direction of the reception desk. She was walking quickly, clearly in a hurry to get somewhere, and she didn't notice Bobby kneeling on the floor until she was almost on top of him. When she did see him, her expression showed annoyance rather than concern. "Excuse me," she said, sharply, stepping carefully around Bobby's outstretched arm without offering to help. Her tone suggested that Bobby was somehow at fault for being in her way, rather than being a person who had accidentally dropped his papers and was trying to clean up the mess. Bobby looked up at her briefly, his face showing embarrassment but no anger. "Sorry, ma'am," he said quietly, though she was already past him and moving toward the elevator. He went back to collecting his papers, moving slowly but methodically to gather each document. A young man in hospital scrubs approached from the other direction, carrying a clipboard and walking with the purposeful stride of someone who had places to be and people to see. He was probably a medical technician or nursing assistant, someone who should have been trained to help patients in distress. But like the woman before him, he simply stepped around Bobby without breaking stride or offering assistance. As Bobby continued gathering his papers, more people passed by. Some stepped over his outstretched arm, others walked around him in a wide arc, and a few muttered under their breath about obstacles in the walkway. Not one person stopped to help or even asked if he needed assistance. It was as if Bobby had become invisible, a problem to be navigated around rather than a person who might need help. The medication list had slid the farthest, ending up partially under a chair 3 seats away from where Bobby had been sitting. Getting to it required him to crawl forward on his hands and knees, a position that was both physically uncomfortable and deeply humiliating for a man who had once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire. His old army jacket rode up slightly as he moved, revealing the edge of a scar on his lower back where shrapnel had torn through his uniform decades earlier. A security guard stationed near the main entrance noticed the commotion and began walking over. Bobby felt a moment of hope that someone was finally going to offer help, but that hope quickly faded when he heard the guard's first words. "Sir, you're creating a safety hazard in the walkway," the guard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to giving orders and expecting immediate compliance. He was probably in his 40s, wearing a uniform that was crisp and well-maintained, and he had the bearing of someone who took his job seriously, but perhaps not always with the right priorities. Bobby looked up from where he was kneeling, still reaching for his medication list. "I'm sorry, officer. I just dropped my papers and I'm trying to pick them up. I'll be done in just a minute." The guard looked down at Bobby with the kind of expression that suggested he saw this as a problem, to be solved rather than a person to be helped. "Well, you need to move faster. This is a main walkway and people need to get through here. You can't just set up camp in the middle of the floor." The comment about setting up camp brought a few chuckles from people within earshot, as if Bobby had deliberately chosen to make himself comfortable on the floor, rather than accidentally dropping his papers. The laughter was quiet but noticeable, adding another layer of humiliation to an already difficult situation. Bobby finally managed to retrieve his medication list and began the slow process of getting back to his feet. The guard watched impatiently, tapping his foot in a way that made it clear he considered Bobby's careful movements to be unnecessarily slow. When Bobby used the chair to pull himself upright, his face was flushed from the exertion and embarrassment of the whole ordeal. "Next time, maybe be more careful with your paperwork," the guard said as he walked away, delivering the comment loud, enough for others to hear. It was the kind of advice that might have been helpful if delivered with kindness, but the tone made it sound more like a criticism than a suggestion. Bobby settled back into his chair and began organizing his papers, again trying to put them back in the order they had been before his accident. His hands were shaking more noticeably now, the stress of the situation affecting his ability to handle the documents smoothly. Several times papers slipped from his fingers, though fortunately they landed on his lap rather than on the floor. Again. The conversation that had been happening around the waiting room resumed, but now it had a new focus. People who had witnessed Bobby's struggle with his papers began adding their own commentary about elderly people who couldn't manage simple tasks without creating problems for everyone else. "I swear, some people just shouldn't be allowed out by themselves," said the woman in business clothes who had been complaining earlier. "I mean, if you can't handle carrying a few pieces of paper without dropping them all over the place, maybe you need to bring someone with you to keep track of your stuff." Her companion nodded in agreement, adding his own observation about personal responsibility and the importance of being prepared for medical appointments. The conversation grew to include several other people who had witnessed the paper dropping incident, each person contributing their own thoughts about aging, independence, and the inconvenience that elderly people sometimes caused for others. What none of them knew, and what Bobby would never tell them, was that his hands shook not from age-related tremors but from nerve damage sustained when he had crawled through a minefield to rescue a wounded soldier. The scars on his back, briefly visible when his jacket had ridden up, came from the same incident that had earned him a medal for valor and a lifetime of physical reminders of his service. Bobby continued organizing his papers, listening to the conversations around him with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. He had faced real enemies in real combat, had stared death in the face more times than he cared to remember, and had learned to distinguish between actual threats and mere rudeness. As his appointment time approached, Bobby checked his watch and realized that he was now running late due to the time spent collecting his papers. The irony wasn't lost on him that his careful habit of arriving early had been undone by a simple accident and the lack of basic human kindness from the people around him. He stood up slowly, gathering his papers and his dignity, and approached the reception desk to let them know he was ready for his appointment. The same assistant who had been impatient with him earlier looked up with barely concealed irritation, as if Bobby's presence was somehow an interruption to her more important tasks. The waiting room continued its normal rhythm, with people coming and going, conversations continuing and life proceeding as if nothing significant had happened. For most of the people there, Bobby's struggle had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a brief interruption in their day that was already forgotten. But for Bobby, it was another reminder of how invisible he had become in a world that seemed to have less and less patience for people who moved slowly, spoke quietly, or needed a little extra time to manage the simple tasks that younger people took for granted. Bobby had just finished reorganizing his papers when he heard the familiar sound of the automatic doors opening near the main entrance. He didn't look up at first, assuming it was just another patient or visitor arriving for their appointment. The waiting room had seen a steady stream of people throughout the morning, and one more arrival didn't seem particularly noteworthy. But something was different about this entrance. The conversations that had been happening around the waiting room began to quiet down. Not all at once, but gradually, like ripples spreading across a pond. People started looking toward the entrance with expressions of curiosity and surprise, their previous discussions about Bobby and elderly people in general suddenly forgotten. Bobby glanced up from his papers to see what had captured everyone's attention, and his breath caught in his throat. Walking through the entrance was a woman in full military dress uniform, her posture straight and confident, her every movement speaking of years of discipline and command. The uniform was pristine, with crisp creases that could probably cut paper and shoes polished to a mirror shine. General Patricia Williams stood about 5 feet 8 inches tall, with graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her in a single glance. Her uniform jacket displayed row after row of ribbons and decorations, including several that Bobby recognized as awards given only to those who had seen serious combat and performed with exceptional valor. The 3 stars on her shoulder boards caught the fluorescent lights of the waiting room, marking her as a lieutenant general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire military. It wasn't unusual to see military personnel at the VA Medical Center, but it was extremely rare to see someone of such high rank, especially in full-dress uniform, rather than casual clothes. As General Williams moved into the waiting room, the atmosphere changed completely. The receptionist who had been rude to Bobby earlier suddenly sat up straighter in her chair, her casual demeanor replaced by something approaching professional attention. The security guard who had made jokes about Bobby's scattered papers now stood at something resembling attention, clearly recognizing the significance of the uniform and rank insignia. Other people in the waiting room began whispering among themselves, speculating about why such a high-ranking officer would be at their local VA facility. Some wondered if she was there for a special ceremony or official visit. Others thought she might be accompanying a family member to an appointment. A few people discreetly took out their phones, hoping to capture a photo of the distinguished visitor. General Williams moved through the waiting room with the kind of purposeful stride that comes from decades of military service. She wasn't hurrying, but every step seemed deliberate and confident. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the layout, the people, and the general atmosphere with the practiced assessment of someone trained to quickly evaluate any situation. The woman in business clothes who had been so critical of Bobby earlier now seemed starstruck by the presence of such a high-ranking military officer. She whispered excitedly to her companion, pointing out the various ribbons and decorations on the general's uniform. Her earlier complaints about elderly veterans seemed to have been completely forgotten in the excitement of seeing real military pageantry up close. Jennifer, the medical assistant who had been impatient with Bobby's struggles with the tablet, suddenly appeared from the back office area. She moved quickly toward the general with the kind of eager helpfulness that she hadn't shown to any other patient that morning. Her entire demeanor had shifted from tired indifference to alert professionalism. "General Williams," Jennifer said, her voice carrying a respect that had been notably absent from her earlier interactions. "We're honored to have you here today. Is there anything special we can do to assist you with your visit?" The general acknowledged Jennifer's greeting with a polite nod, but her attention seemed to be focused elsewhere. Her eyes continued scanning the waiting room, as if she was looking for something or someone specific. The intensity of her gaze made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats, wondering if they had somehow done something wrong. Bobby watched this interaction with quiet interest, his military training helping him recognize the significance of the general's rank and bearing. He had served under many officers during his time in the Army, though none had achieved the level of command that General Williams clearly held. Despite everything that had happened to him that morning, he felt a surge of pride at seeing such a distinguished representative of the military. The general's scanning gaze continued across the waiting room, moving systematically from person to person. When her eyes reached the area where Bobby was sitting, something extraordinary happened. Her confident stride faltered for just a moment, and her professional composure cracked slightly. Her eyes widened with what appeared to be recognition, followed quickly by an expression of complete shock. For several seconds, General Williams stood perfectly still in the middle of the waiting room, staring directly at Bobby with an intensity that made everyone else in the area turn to see what had captured her attention. The silence in the room became almost complete, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of medical equipment from the examination areas. Bobby, unaware that he was the focus of the general's attention, continued organizing his papers. His hearing aid was still turned off, so he missed the subtle change in the room's atmosphere. He was focused on making sure his insurance card was easily accessible when his name was called, a task that required his full concentration given his shaking hands and the morning's earlier difficulties. The general began moving again, but now, her path was clearly directed toward Bobby's corner of the waiting room. Each step seemed deliberate and purposeful, but also carried an emotional weight that hadn't been there moments before. Her professional military bearing remained intact, but there was something else in her expression now, something that looked almost like reverence. People throughout the waiting room began to notice the general's destination, and conversations started up again as they speculated about why such a high-ranking officer would be approaching the elderly man who had been causing minor disruptions all morning. The woman in business clothes looked particularly confused, unable to understand why someone of the general's obvious importance would be interested in Bobby. The security guard, who had been dismissive of Bobby's paper-gathering difficulties now, watched with growing confusion as the general approached. His earlier jokes about setting up camp in the walkway seemed less funny now that someone of such high rank was clearly interested in the same man he had been criticizing. Jennifer followed, behind the general at a respectful distance, her curiosity clearly piqued by this unexpected development. She had processed hundreds of patients and visitors, but she had never seen a three-star general show personal interest in any individual patient, especially not someone who seemed as ordinary as Bobby had appeared to her. As General Williams drew closer to Bobby's chair, her pace slowed slightly as if she was giving herself time to process what she was seeing and prepare for what she was about to do. Her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, began to move into a more formal position. Her already straight posture seemed to become even more rigid and ceremonial. The entire waiting room held its collective breath as the general stopped directly in front of Bobby's chair. The morning's earlier conversations about technology, elderly, people, and inconvenience seemed to fade into irrelevance as everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. Bobby, still focused on his papers and unaware of the attention he had attracted, looked up when he noticed someone standing directly in front of him. When he saw the general's uniform and rank insignia, His own military training kicked in automatically. Despite his age and physical limitations, he began the process of trying to stand up, recognizing that proper military courtesy required him to show respect to such a high-ranking officer. But before Bobby could complete the motion of standing, General Williams did something that shocked everyone in the waiting room into complete silence. She came to a position of rigid attention, her heels coming together with an audible click that echoed across the now silent room. Then, with the precision and formality of a parade ground ceremony, she raised her right hand in a perfect military salute. The silence in the waiting room was so complete that you could hear the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. General Williams stood at perfect attention in front of Bobby's chair, her right hand raised in a crisp military salute that spoke of decades of training and discipline. Every eye in the room was fixed on this unexpected scene, and time seemed to have stopped completely. Bobby looked up at the general with confusion and surprise. His military instincts, buried but never forgotten after all these years, told him to respond appropriately to such a formal gesture. Despite his trembling hands and aching joints, he began to rise from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had been through more than most people could imagine. As Bobby stood, something remarkable happened. The tremor in his left hand, which had been noticeable all morning, seemed to steady itself. The uncertainty that had marked his movements earlier was replaced by muscle memory that went back more than 50 years. He straightened his shoulders as much as his old injuries would allow, and brought his own right hand up in a return salute. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the two veterans stood facing each other in perfect military formation. The general, representing the pinnacle of military achievement and success, and Bobby, representing the quiet dignity of those who had served without recognition or fanfare. The contrast between their uniforms was striking, but the respect between them was unmistakable. General Williams held her salute for several long seconds before bringing her hand down to her side. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the silent waiting room, each word delivered with the precision and authority that came with her rank. "Sergeant First Class Martinez," she said, using Bobby's full military rank and surname. The formality of her address sent a ripple of surprise through the watching crowd. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." The word "sir," coming from a 3-star general and directed toward the man who had been dismissed and mocked all morning, hit the waiting room like a thunderbolt. People who had been complaining about Bobby's hearing aid, his struggles with technology, and his scattered papers suddenly found themselves trying to understand how this ordinary-looking elderly man had earned the respect of such a high-ranking military officer. Bobby completed his salute and lowered his hand, his voice quiet but clear as he responded. "General Williams, I never expected to see you again after all these years." There was warmth in his voice, the kind that comes from shared experiences that most people could never understand. The general's professional demeanor softened slightly as she continued speaking, but her voice remained loud enough for everyone in the waiting room to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, turning slightly to address the watching crowd, "you are in the presence of one of the finest soldiers I have ever had the privilege to serve alongside." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Sergeant Martinez and I served together in Vietnam, where I had the honor of witnessing firsthand the kind of courage and selflessness that defines the very best of our military." The woman in business clothes, who had been so vocal in her criticism of Bobby earlier, sat frozen in her chair. Her mouth hung open slightly as she tried to reconcile the image of the fumbling elderly man she had been mocking with the war hero being described by the general. Jennifer, the medical assistant who had shown such impatience with Bobby's technology struggles, felt her face flush with embarrassment as she remembered her earlier comments about basic computer skills. The security guard who had made jokes about Bobby setting up camp in the walkway looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. General Williams continued her explanation, her voice gaining strength and emotion as she spoke. "During the, Battle of Firebase Charlie in 1968, Sergeant Martinez saved the lives of 17 American soldiers, including mine. When our position was overrun by enemy forces, and I was wounded and unable to move, Sergeant Martinez crawled through enemy fire to reach me. The waiting room remained absolutely silent as the general's words painted a picture that was completely at odds with everything the observers had assumed about Bobby. The man they had seen as a burden, an inconvenience, and a symbol of everything frustrating about elderly people was being revealed as someone who had risked everything for his fellow soldiers. He carried me and 2 other wounded soldiers to safety, the general continued, making multiple trips through a battlefield that was under constant enemy fire. He was hit twice by sniper fire during those rescue attempts, but he refused medical attention until every wounded soldier had been evacuated. Bobby stood quietly during this recitation of his service, his face showing neither pride nor embarrassment. He had learned long ago that some experiences were too profound to be fully understood by those who hadn't lived through them. The medals and commendations he had received meant less to him than the knowledge that good men had made it home to their families because of his actions. The general's voice grew even more reverent as she continued. Sergeant Martinez was captured during his final rescue attempt and spent 14 months as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. During that time, he was tortured and interrogated repeatedly, but he never gave the enemy any information that could have put other American soldiers at risk. A gasp went through the waiting room as people began to understand the full scope of what Bobby had endured. The tremor in his hands, which they had seen as a sign of weakness or age, suddenly took on new meaning. The careful way he moved, which they had interpreted as slowness, was revealed as the result of injuries sustained in service to his country. When he was finally released and returned to the United States, General Williams said, Sergeant Martinez was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and the Purple Heart. He is one of the most decorated soldiers of his generation. The silence that followed this revelation was different from the earlier quiet. It was the silence of people who suddenly realized they had completely misjudged someone and who were trying to process the enormity of their mistake. Several people in the waiting room looked down at their hands, unable to meet Bobby's eyes. Bobby finally spoke, his voice still quiet but carrying a strength that hadn't been apparent earlier. Thank you for your kind words, General, but I was just doing my job. Every one of those men would have done the same thing for me. This simple statement, delivered without any attempt at false modesty or self-promotion, somehow made Bobby's heroism even more impressive. Here was a man who had performed acts of extraordinary courage under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable, and he spoke about it as if it were nothing more than what anyone would have done. General Williams shook her head firmly. Sergeant Martinez, what you did went far beyond duty. You saved my life and you saved the lives of 16 other American soldiers. Because of your actions, those men were able to go home to their wives and children. Some of them now have grandchildren, who exist because of your courage. She turned once again to address the waiting room, her voice taking on the tone of command that had made her one of the most respected leaders in the military. This man represents the very best of what America has to offer. He put his life on the line for people he barely knew, and he paid a price for that service that he carries with him every single day. The general looked directly at the people, who had been criticizing Bobby earlier, though she didn't single anyone out by name. When you see an elderly veteran struggling with modern technology or moving slowly, or needing a little extra help, remember that you might be looking at someone who sacrificed everything so that you could live in freedom. Bobby raised his hand slightly, a gesture that asked for permission to speak. General, with respect, these folks didn't know about any of that. They were just having a busy morning, and I was in their way. No harm done. This gracious response, coming from a man who had been mocked and dismissed all morning, left the waiting room speechless. Here was someone who had every right to be angry or hurt, but who chose instead to show understanding and forgiveness to the people who had treated him poorly. General Williams smiled, an expression that transformed her stern military features into something warm and human. Sergeant Martinez, your generosity of spirit is exactly what I remember from our time in Vietnam. You always looked out for others, even when you had every reason to look out for yourself. She turned to address the medical staff who had gathered to witness this extraordinary scene. I trust that Sergeant Martinez will receive the very best care this facility has to offer. He has earned that consideration through his service to our country. Jennifer stepped forward, her earlier impatience completely gone. Absolutely, General. We'll make sure Sergeant Martinez gets everything he needs. Her voice was respectful and sincere, a complete change from her earlier dismissive tone. The general extended her hand to Bobby, and they shook with the firm grip of old soldiers who had shared experiences that bound them together across the decades. Sergeant Martinez, it has been an honor to see you again. I hope your appointment goes well, and I hope we have the chance to visit again soon. As General Williams prepared to leave for her own appointment, she paused and looked around the waiting room one final time.